Thank you for inviting me to speak about this really important topic. Probably, like many of you, I've worked with plants my whole life. I planted trees on the Christmas tree farms where I worked. I planted the crops I grew for the farmer's market. And wherever I lived, I planted what I thought were oases for wildlife. That is until I read Doug Tallamy's first book, Bringing Nature Home. I learned that most of the plants I grew were introduced species, and worse yet, many were ecologically harmful plants. I began spending all the time I could removing invasive plants, sowing seed, planting native plants, and chasing off the deer. One Saturday afternoon, I looked around at my neighbors' huge lawns and listened to their noisy lawnmowers, and it all felt so hopeless. I knew that the Tallamys lived somewhere in southeastern Pennsylvania, which is where I live, and I suddenly had an idea. Why don't we just move near the Tallamys? The next week, I was weeding Creeping Charlie out from underneath my persimmon tree and came across this scrap of paper. It was a corner of an envelope with a return address label on it that read, "The Tallamy Family." It turned out that the Tallamys lived just 2 properties over. Now, there was no way I could just walk down their driveway and introduce myself. I come from a fruit-growing background. A list of fruit species I used to grow reads like a list of perpetrators in an invasive plant crime novel. Clearly, I couldn't introduce myself to the Tallamys until I had removed all these invasive plants that I had planted. Several years passed by. One summer day, I was once again feeling overwhelmed and somewhat defeated, so I mailed a letter to Dr. Tallamy, introducing myself and saying, "I love your books, but it would be so helpful if there were a step-by-step guide to go along with your books." And, in so many words, he replied, "Great idea, write it." And that's how I came to spend 4 years of my life neglecting my gardens and writing Nature's Action Guide. The guide takes an environmentally friendly, cost-conscious, and toward zero waste approach. The goal of the book is to help people from all demographics, regardless of their skills or means, to take the actions needed to support biodiversity. It features the 15 urgently needed actions shown here. These actions are listed in the handout, which you can find on naturesactionguide.org/biodiversity. All the references and links I mention are also listed in the handout. I'll post this link again at the end of my talk. You can probably guess the answer to this question. What action can we take that not only helps to restore biodiversity, but incidentally also addresses climate instability? We can build wildlife habitat. It's not often that good news and climate instability appear in the same sentence, but I think it's really good news that it turns out that our efforts to support biodiversity also help with mitigation and adaptation to climate instability. An ecological landscape is different from traditional U.S. landscapes by its focus on providing wildlife habitat. A resilient wildlife habitat must offer food, water, cover, and nesting. And a really positive thing about this is that building wildlife habitat is something that you and I can do in whatever spaces we have. Let's explore some strategies for doing exactly that. When it comes to supporting biodiversity, the topic of protection is of prime importance. The hazards to wildlife from our homes and in our landscapes are such that proactively protecting the wildlife our native plants will attract may well do as much to support biodiversity as the wildlife habitat we create. In the face of biodiversity loss and climate change, perhaps the most important animal populations that need our protection are insects and other invertebrates. If you ever doubt that your efforts to build wildlife habitat are important and urgently needed, read this article. It describes the experience of ecologist Daniel Jensen. One night in 1978, in the middle of a dense Costa Rican forest, he took a photograph of moths in which approximately 3,000 species of moths were identified, all different sizes, shapes, and colors. Not 3,000 individual moths, but 3,000 species. Now he hangs a sheet in the same setting, but just a few moths flutter to the light. Most sobering of all, This observation took place in a pristine landscape largely uninhabited by humans. Without healthy, predominantly native plants and supportive habitat, we lose our caterpillars, the foundation of the terrestrial food web, our pollinators that ensure the reproduction of approximately 90% of flowering plants, our beneficial predators that control insect pests, and our decomposers that help process our waste. Insects can survive in a world without us, but we humans cannot survive in a world without insects. Despite the shocking insect population declines worldwide, we live in a twisted reality in which most of our society is engaged in a war on insects. What can each of us do to increase insect populations? There are easy things we can do, like using non-toxic pest control methods, choosing plants that support insects, and changing how we light our spaces. We need to care for our landscapes without resorting to toxic chemicals. For example, neonicotinoids, neonics for short, are a group of systemic insecticides that work by moving through a plant's entire structure, contaminating every part of the plant, from the roots to the pollen. They're intended to kill an insect that feeds on the plant, and they do that really well. We can protect insects with our shopping dollars, for example, by buying plants only from nurseries that refuse to use neonicotinoids. Pesticides really aren't needed in a residential DIY wildlife habitat. For alternative pest management methods, visit beyondpesticides.org. At our homes and in our communities, we have lots of opportunities to encourage and protect insects and other nocturnal wildlife. Some of the easiest but most powerful actions to support biodiversity and climate action relate to how we light our spaces. The rich ecology of nocturnal wildlife depends on darkness. Artificial light at night even negatively impacts plants, affecting their growth, flowering, dormancy, and plant-insect interactions such as pollination. Moths are fatally attracted to artificial light at night. Given the importance of caterpillars in the food web, this is particularly concerning. Fortunately, this is a problem we all can help to solve by changing our essential outdoor lighting to amber or yellow LED bulbs. Unfortunately, amber or yellow lights don't protect birds. Migratory bird populations are especially vulnerable to artificial light at night. Birds become disoriented and strike glass or fly around all night until they finally land exhausted. At this point, they're vulnerable to other hazards. Lights off is best to protect birds. Unfortunately, changing to yellow and amber lights doesn't help fireflies either. Yellow and amber lights, in particular, interfere with the flashing signals fireflies use to attract mates. When artificial light is present, female fireflies rarely mate or don't mate at all. Switching to red lights, or better yet, turning out the lights completely, protects some bat species since artificial light at night interferes with their roosting, foraging, and flight patterns. It might seem that bats could forage more easily around lights, but some bat species may starve to death before leaving their roosts as they wait for the darkness of night that never comes. Turning out the lights includes pulling your blinds or curtains. Where outdoor light's absolutely necessary, light fixtures should include dusk to dawn motion sensors and timers. Shield fixtures to direct light downward where it's needed and nowhere else. Visit darksky.org to learn how to protect the night skies where you live. The Texas Dark Sky chapter offers a wide selection of educational resources. Protecting the night skies is the perfect first step towards supporting biodiversity because it can be as simple as turning off the lights or adding light-blocking curtains. With a few changes in our habits and minimal expense, we can create unofficial dark sky parks of our own. One of the most deadly ecological traps are the glass windows in our homes and throughout our communities. Early in the morning, before street cleaners make their morning pass, volunteers walk downtown city streets to pick up and record glass strike victims, like this tragic collection. You've likely heard that sickening thump on a window at your house. In the US alone, it's estimated that well over 1 million birds strike glass per day at our home windows. After striking glass, birds may fly off. The majority die later from internal injuries, broken bones, predation, and other dangers. We can help to prevent this tragedy by applying stickers or painting designs on the outside of our windows. I've included the stencil for making these leaf stickers and a grid for painting dots in the handout. Remember the 2x2 rule. Markings must be placed on the outside of the windows. Gaps larger than 2 inches in single stickers simply don't offer protection. Right now, you might be thinking this must make it horrible to look out the window, but it really doesn't. If you live in a fancy neighborhood, consider purchasing products such as evenly spaced dots applied from a roll of tape or film. Visit the American Bird Conservancy website for a database of glass strike prevention products and solutions. We must protect our wildlife habitat from our beloved cats. It's hard to get one's head around the fact that our pet cats kill between 1 to 2.7 million birds per day. Stray cats such as barn cats kill 3 times that many. We can still have cats. We just need to create interesting indoor worlds for them and care for them in a wildlife-friendly way. In addition to protecting the wildlife we attract, sometimes we need to protect our plants from wildlife. Along with habitat loss, in many regions, deer are a leading cause in the decline of biodiversity. A fence is the best defense against deer and rabbits, but not just any fence will do. In the handout, I've included these 2 pages from Nature's Action Guide with a DIY how-to for installing deer and rabbit exclosures. But fences aren't acceptable in many neighborhoods. You may have to settle for individual wire cages around young trees and shrubs. I find that motion-activated sprinklers like this one are effective, but they require a water source and upkeep. Spraying homemade or commercial deer repellents can work, but they must be consistently reapplied. Recently, I've been hearing about tricho, a deer deterrent used in forest restoration that sounds quite promising. Its active ingredient is sheep fat. Apparently, it's effective and application lasts about 6 months. It's produced in Europe and pricey, but it's worth keeping an eye out for increased availability in the US. No plant is deer-proof, but aside from deer-proof fencing, choosing deer-resistant plants is still the best bet. Rutgers Cooperative Extension offers a downloadable, comprehensive list of over 500 landscape plants, including many native plants that are rated on their deer resistance, from rarely damaged to frequently severely damaged. Deer on my property don't touch golden groundsel, but they eat it at the Talamis just 2 doors over. Experiment by planting only 1 or 2 of a recommended plant before investing in a large quantity. Mix deer favorites with plants they don't like. Although planting species in masses helps pollinators to optimize their foraging, if deer are a problem for you, try out Larry Weiner's recommendation to plant a deer favorite with a deer-resistant plant, even planting the plants in the same hole. If deer are a problem in your landscape, watch this video listed in the handout for a crash course in deer behavior, deterrence, and landscaping tips. With our protections in place, we're ready to find or make space for wildlife habitat. Short of buying more land, there are 3 main ways of doing this. We can find space between existing plants in our landscape and make space by removing lawn or by removing invasive introduced plants. Typical U.S. landscapes with their mulched foundation beds make finding space between existing plants an easy place to start adding wildlife habitat. The X's shown here are places where low-growing native ground covers or perennials can be planted in a 12-inch grid between these existing plants. The only good thing about endless lawn is its endless potential for making space for wildlife habitat. We each need to remove as much lawn as possible. As the largest irrigated crop in the U.S., lawns use nearly 1/3 of all residential water, to the tune of 9 billion gallons per day of drinkable water. To add insult to injury, mowing our lawns for 1 hour emits as much air pollution as driving a new passenger car for 300 miles. Using a commercial leaf blower for an hour, you might as well drive from Long Island, New York to Houston, Texas. Consider which areas of your lawn are logical areas to start shrinking your lawn. I added this island bed to the middle of my front lawn to serve as a refuge for small creatures fleeing for safety during mowing. These 3 trees were tedious to mow around. Now, a single kidney bean-shaped bed makes it so much easier to mow. Replace poorly growing grass that looks crummy with native plants, many of which thrive in poor soil, like this colorful display in its first year. Shrinking the lawn to create pupation sites not only is a win for caterpillars, but it's so much easier not having to mow under low-hanging branches. Once you've decided upon a location, follow these steps in the handout to shrink this area of lawn. Eco-damaging plants, often referred to as invasive plants, need to be removed to safeguard and make room for eco-beneficial plants. The term invasive can be problematic because it oversimplifies complex ecological relationships and it reinforces aggressive language. For these reasons, where possible, I've begun alternatively referring to invasive plants as eco-harmful plants. These plants are not inherently bad. In fact, they likely play a beneficial role in an ecosystem somewhere else in the world. For example, lance-leaf coreopsis, a valuable deer-resistant pollinator plant native in many U.S. counties, is one of Japan's most harmful species. If you have stiltgrass in your yard, then you likely have first-hand experience with a difficult non-native plant. On the left is my front garden bed in the summer of 2023. There were a couple of stiltgrass plants which I removed. Otherwise, the bed was pretty clean, except for the pre-existing seed bank. In the summer of 2024, due to a serious injury, I couldn't get out in the garden, and here, run over with stiltgrass is the same space. This past August, I spent 20 mornings removing stiltgrass. Here's one morning's efforts. At the residential scale, we can control almost all the problematic plants we encounter in our yards using non-toxic control methods. Your best defense against invasive plants is being able to identify them at different stages, especially as seedlings. Take them out as soon as you spot them. A quick way to get to know the most problematic pests in the U.S. is to visit invasivespeciesinfo.gov. Only 55 terrestrial plant species are profiled here, but these are the troublemakers we all need to be able to identify and remove. Once you've determined that a plant is introduced, or worse yet, noxious, hop on to invasive.org for a comprehensive list of invasive plants. Note that some of the plants featured may be beneficial native plants where you live, such as eastern white pine, but almost all of them are problematic introduced plants. Plan ahead to prevent eco-harmful species from getting a foothold in the first place. These strategies are examples of how the best practices for caring for a wildlife habitat also address the impacts of climate instability. For example, planting densely shades soil from high heat and protects soil structure from both heavy rainfall and evaporation during drought. If you come from a traditional gardening background, you might be surprised, as I was, that some of the weeds I was pulling were actually ecologically beneficial native plants, such as the ones shown here. I'm embarrassed to admit that it took me the longest time to realize this, but when I began using the iNaturalist app to identify the weeds I was pulling, and then the Bonap maps to find out if they were friend or foe, there were a few real surprises. It turns out that spotted spurge is actually a tough native ground layer plant that can withstand some foot traffic and dog play. Clearweed often shelters insects like this one, and horse nettles always happily covered in insects. I won't be pulling any more weeds without first confirming their identity. We've looked at finding and making space for wildlife habitat. Now let's look at some resources for choosing plants to boost wildlife and plant populations. Our plant choices are a key to a thriving wildlife habitat. Plants provide nourishment, cover from predators, and safe places to reproduce. Small populations lack the resilience that large populations have when drought, extreme temperatures, or something else takes a heavy toll on a population. We need to build up and protect local abundance now to give populations as much time as possible to get established in our landscapes and strengthened so that they can withstand the challenges of the future. Why is it so important that we choose native plants? Animals and plants evolve over time to find their ecological niche. Some plant species are generalists and can survive in a variety of conditions, in contrast to specialists that require precise growing conditions. For example, the generalist black cherry is a fast-growing tree with a wide distribution from the East Coast to Arizona, in contrast to the pitcher plant that requires boggy, acidic soil, full sun, and high humidity, significantly limiting its distribution. When it comes to insects, generalists are those with a wide variety of food options or other adaptations, while specialists are uniquely adapted to one or just a few options. Insect specialization is why the vast majority of introduced plants, although really beautiful in our landscapes, fail to support the full range of diversity of our local wildlife. If it weren't for specialization, we wouldn't have to spend so much time removing invasive plants, and we could all continue planting the thousands of stunningly gorgeous introduced plants. But specialization does occur in nature. For example, although some caterpillars are generalists because they can feed on many different plant species, the majority are specialists. If the host plants for specialists aren't present, the specialists won't be present either. And that's why we need to choose native plants. To survive, birds need thousands of insects to raise a single brood. Some birds, such as tree swallows, primarily feed their young flying insects such as bees, flies, and wasps. But for many birds, including most songbirds, caterpillars are the top item on the baby food menu. To have caterpillars, we need to choose plants that butterflies and moths have co-evolved with. As we've learned from Doug Tallamy, this makes the number of Lepidoptera caterpillar species that feed on a plant an ideal metric for identifying keystone plants. Planting keystone species will give you the most bang for your ecological buck. But some caterpillars specialize on plants that are not keystone species. The monarch caterpillar, with its dependence on milkweed, makes milkweed a perfect example of a host plant that isn't a keystone plant, but that critically needs to be planted if we're to prevent the monarch species from going extinct. To have butterflies, we need to choose plants for caterpillars. Here's a tool for doing exactly that. The National Wildlife Federation Native Plant Finder, a resource that Doug Tallamy helped to create, is a very helpful tool for identifying host plants for caterpillars. It's super easy to use. Click Set Location and enter your zip code. Click Find Native Plants to view the top keystone plants for your region. Learning which plants are keystone plants makes planting for caterpillars a lot easier. In this area, oak is the top keystone genus, hosting 521 moth and butterfly species. You can also find out the specific host plant for a specific butterfly or moth that you'd like to attract. Here's the easiest way to do this. Let's say you'd like to attract Luna moths. Just type in Luna moth in the search bar. The caterpillar of the Luna moth is considered a generalist with 25 possible host plant genera for its caterpillars, including oak, cherry, and willow. The profile shows the top 15 host plants for its caterpillar. An interesting aside, the adult Luna moth doesn't eat. They have no mouth parts or digestive organs, and they only live for about a week to reproduce. You can explore many different Lepidoptera profiles by clicking Find Butterflies. The profiles are arranged by the specialists, the pickiest eaters, first. The first 4 Lepidoptera shown here for this area use only one genus as a host plant. Fortunately for them, these are not rare plants. Willow and cherry are among the top 10 keystone genera for this region, demonstrating how keystone plants support many specialists, even very picky ones. You can click on the caterpillar profile for a list of its host genera, and if you click on the plant genus profile, some of these have a list of the species that are native to your local ecoregion. Let's look at some resources for choosing plants for pollinators. From bats to bees to birds and moths, Pollinator Partnership offers some handy planting guides for selecting plants for pollinators. It describes this region's different pollinators and the plant traits they depend on. It also lists the native plants that attract pollinators in this region, along with lots of helpful information. Native bees play a key role in a resilient wildlife habitat. 20 to 45% of them are pollen specialists. Notice that both goldenrod, solidago, and sunflower, helianthus, are the top genera when it comes to supporting native pollen specialist bees in the eastern U.S. It's worth noting that in the mid-Atlantic, the top 4 genera for native pollen specialist bees, shown here, are all also keystone species for caterpillars. We need to make a concerted effort to include species from these genera in our landscapes. You may already be growing some of these. Let's go a step further with the help of horticulturalist and conservationist Jared Fowler and wildlife biologist Sam Droege. They provide us with comprehensive lists of U.S. native pollen specialist bee species and the plant genera they specialize on. You can find out the nectar and pollen gathering time and pollen host plant family for each native bee species. This gives us information that can help us choose the plants rare native pollen specialist bees need to survive. Jared Fowler provides us with another list, host plants of the eastern U.S. This list is especially helpful because it also includes sources for hard-to-find plants. Note that not all the links still work, but it's still a helpful starting point. Scroll down on this page for a list of plants that are critical for vulnerable native pollen specialist bee populations, but for which seed and parent plants are especially hard to find for purchase. If you're an experienced gardener, you might want to be part of the urgently needed effort to propagate and plant these plants. Different species of native bees emerge from their nests at different times during the growing season, and for some, their active nectar and pollen gathering stage lasts just a couple of weeks. The flowers they specialize on need to be in bloom for these bees to survive. For help choosing a sequence of blooms, the Pollinator Partnership provides handy native pollinator garden recipe cards. These plants are a good starting point for ensuring a sequence of blooms. Whatever else we do, Sam Droege urges us to plant flowers, which includes flowering shrubs and trees, in whatever spaces we can. He explains that it takes just 5 flowers to raise one baby bee. A large flower, like a sunflower, supplies enough pollen and nectar to feed 100 bee cells. Even just a container on a balcony filled with flowers could mean a native bee survives. As we've already seen, nesting and water are 2 of the 4 essential elements of wildlife habitat. The plants we choose and the way we care for our landscape has a profound impact on the quality of nesting our property offers. You've heard the rally cries, leave the leaves, save the stems. This is all about providing nesting. Native and especially keystone trees will attract caterpillars. Mowed or fabric mulched beds beneath them are an ecological trap. Caterpillars drop from the tree to pupate, but either get mowed over or can't burrow into the soil. By leaving the leaves and filling the spaces beneath shrubs and trees with plants, we support moths and butterflies by creating caterpillar pupation sites or soft landings. For more about soft landings, visit pollinator expert Heather Holmes' website. Insects need nesting places. Fortunately, planting a variety of native plants will provide pithy and hollow stem plants that offer nesting sites for cavity nesting insects, such as bees, beetles, and wasps. Resist the urge to tidy up in fall and early spring. Where tidying up is necessary, cut stems to varying heights between 8 to 24 inches. In a formal neighborhood, stems cut 8 to 12 inches tend to look tidy enough. Find several places on your property where the ground can be left bare for ground nesting bees. The Xerxes Society recommends sunny, well-drained, undisturbed patches of bare or sparsely vegetated soil, ideally on a gentle slope where bees can easily access the ground to dig their nests, with sandy or rocky spots being excellent nesting sites. We can attract beetles, another important group of pollinators, by providing moist leaf litter, putting logs and rocks in our garden beds, and researching and planting the host plants for different beetle species. Spiders are essential predators and prey in the food web. Leave spider webs and plant densely in layers to provide structural diversity for hiding spots, hunting perches, and anchor points for web building. Encourage the birds that visit your wildlife habitat to stay and nest by providing the birds with nesting spots, dense shrubs for protection and nesting, dead trees when safe for cavity nesting, and open branch trees for nesting for birds such as hummingbirds and orioles. The National Audubon Society's Native Plants Database is a very handy tool for bird lovers. Enter your zip code, and this generates an illustrated list of plants native to your region that will attract and support different bird families. Each plant profile, such as this one for American beautyberry, leads to information about the different families of birds the plant may attract. Click each bird profile to see its range, conservation status, and much more. Include water for wildlife into your wildlife habitat design. Add as many water features for wildlife as you can reasonably take care of. And when possible, add larger water features. They take more work to install, but they're well worth the effort, as they can offer some of the most exciting wildlife sightings. With everything we've looked at so far, we've actually already covered some strategies for designing for nature. Let's look at some more ways we can design to support insects. Once you've identified a butterfly's preferred nectar plants and its caterpillar's host plants, you can plant them nearby one another. Make it a point to include as many different flower shapes in your design as you can. Pollinators are more likely to visit flowers when there's at least a 3 foot by 3 foot mass of their preferred species. These are called drifts. At planting time, create drifts by intermingling 2 species at the point where they meet. For example, group a mass of purple flowers next to a contrasting mass of yellow flowers, and mix a few together where the 2 masses meet. These drifts of plants will help pollinators forage more efficiently. They're also visually appealing to people. Earlier, we looked at planting a sequence of blooms to benefit insects. With the effects of climate instability, we need to take planting a sequence of blooms one step further and build in functional redundancy. This is just a fancy way of saying we need to plant multiple species that bloom at the same time, ideally aiming for 3 blooming species at any given time during the growing season, such as these 3 spring bloomers. This way, even if some species bloom earlier than they used to or fail to bloom, a sequence of blooms still happens. Strategically place plants to help optimize insects' foraging efficiency. For example, the small carpenter bee forages a mere 22 to 78 yards, so planting masses of their favorites, such as asters, allows these tiny bees to forage efficiently within their limited range. Using an average foraging distance of 820 yards, the Pollinator Pathway program strives to connect properties into a continuous pathway for pollinators, richly planted with the nectar and pollen plants they need. Their website offers a wealth of pollinator resources. Where possible, connect the plantings on your own property. Here in my front yard are 3 young oak trees. Over time, the understory plants will eventually fill in and connect the beds. Optimize your neighbor's plantings by situating your plantings nearby theirs. This begins to create habitat corridors, allowing animals to freely roam and reproduce with other subpopulations. We can use the plants already growing on our property to guide our plant placement. Think of a plant that's growing well for you. It can be an introduced plant or a native plant that's doing well. For example, a thriving patch of dandelions tells us that beard tongue, black-eyed Susan, evening primrose, and goldenrod will do well. And places where one of these native species thrives would be good for any of the others. Traditional gardening often focuses on perennials, yet trees and shrubs require far less care than perennial plantings or lawn. They can quickly fill a space, making them an ideal choice if you're really busy or not inclined toward gardening. Trees and shrubs support high numbers of caterpillars and are extremely valuable sources of pollen and nectar. Plus, some bloom in early spring when not a lot else is blooming. As our climate becomes unstable, build resilience into your landscape. We can do this by choosing a variety of persistent plants that respond to environmental changes in different ways. The fancy term for this strategy is response diversity. Choose a wide variety of plants that include those that are drought, flood, heat or cold tolerant, fire, wind, or deer resistant, and so on, to give your landscape a better chance of weathering an unstable climate. Now let's look at how we can design our landscapes to be attractive to people. How can we design our home landscape for ecology and beauty? Fortunately, except for those who are professional landscape designers, we only need to be the expert landscape designer for our own property. We don't need to know everything. When envisioning ecological planting, it's helpful to observe many landscapes so that you can start to get a feel for what style of design appeals to you. The more rigid an HOA, the more formal the design requirements are likely to be. Different areas of your property may call for different approaches. Make a mental note as to where your aesthetics fall along this continuum. Native plants can fit into whichever aesthetic you prefer. One simple concept of design stems from the savanna hypothesis, which suggests that our perception of beauty in the landscape is shaped by human evolution. Our ancestors found safety in open, vegetated spaces with trees. So, we're instinctually attracted to a spacious landscape of small understory trees with an open canopy of see-through lower branches that separate near the ground into 2 or more trunks underplanted with low-growing plants. By choosing keystone species for these understory trees, employing the savanna approach adds both appeal and ecological function, resulting in a design landscape that fits into any neighborhood. Through decades of studying how people interact with nature, researchers Kaplan, and Ryan identified 4 factors that we can apply to make our landscapes welcoming and appealing. A unifying ground layer is one way to give coherence to a landscape. This might be a matrix of native sedge or a creeping plant, such as in this savanna-like planting at Mount Cuba. Incorporating interesting features into your landscape helps to add visual complexity. Here, a false door gives intrigue to an otherwise imposing wall. Plants that will have winter interest, water features, and colorful flowers add visual appeal. Pathways help give legibility, making it clear how one should navigate around the landscape. Pathways and openings add mystery, guiding visitors through the landscape with the promise that there's more to discover. As Joan Nassauer explained in a 1995 article, surrounding plantings with crisp, clean edges is a fast way to create an orderly frame that tidies up a natural planting. Edges can be intentional, such as the edge around this garden bed, or they may occur incidentally, as a result of structural elements, like this urbanite bench. Surrounding your plantings with crisp, clean edges is a fast way to tidy up a natural planting. Strive to design your garden beds in pleasing shapes and maintain the quality of their edges. Straight lines should be straight, and curved edges should be graceful and smooth. Repeated random masses of a species gives a strong visual presence to a planting, adding a feeling of organization and rhythm. Replacing lawn with natural plantings may upset our less receptive neighbors. We can make our landscape feel familiar and welcoming by adding signage, leaving a patch of grass, providing seating, or planting familiar flowers. These elements can go a long way toward fostering neighborhood acceptance. No space is too small to welcome biodiversity. The handy Thriller Filler Spiller recipe for container planting is also a helpful concept for designing attractive beds. Plan where a few taller accent plants can go, your thrillers. These might be a tall perennial or a clumping grass, a shrub, or a small tree. Then place your fillers, which can be several masses of 3 to 5 medium-height flowering plants or grasses. Place logs and a water feature. Finish off by planting all the gaps with your spiller, such as native sedges or creeping plants like native strawberry. For more complex designs, dig in deeper with the free, downloadable native garden designs shared by Wild Ones. These are a super helpful resource that will help you incorporate professional design into your personal plantings. Visit wildones.org, click Programs, click Native Garden Plans. Scroll down to choose a design. The closest plans for this area are the 2 designs for Princeton, New Jersey, designed by Julie Snell and Lisa McDonald Haynes. These designers have included detailed planting plans for various habitats within a property, including a stream and riparian buffer, a hedgerow and riparian transition, a meadow with a mowed path, mixed shrubs and perennials, and a road buffer. The plant layout and a detailed plant list are provided for each area. Illustrated profiles of each plant include links to a description. You could spend hours reading the tips and checking out the suggested plants on this plan and on plans from other cities as well. There's another important aspect of designing for people: accessibility. As we age, walking or getting up and down may become difficult or impossible. Consider proactively incorporating universal design. Universal design is a fascinating topic that, unfortunately, is beyond the scope of this talk, but the American Society of Landscape Architects explains the elements of universal design and how to incorporate them into gardens by including features such as wide level paths, frequent seating, non-glare ground materials, and much more. These principles can be applied to residential landscapes as well, to help prepare our landscapes for gardening into our later years. My 95-year-old mother tends this native plant garden in Southern California. The garden, in its own way, goes a long way towards sustaining her. Here are 3 books I particularly like about modifying gardens for people with mobility impairments and older adults. Now let's look briefly at some strategies for procuring lots of native plants on a budget. Filling all the layers for a rich ecological landscape requires that we plant generously from ground to sky, but plants are expensive. Fortunately, many native plants are easy to grow from seed, as easy as baking brownies. This allows you to save your plant budget for the hard-to-propagate plants. For $4 for a packet of seeds and several dollars for seeding mix and some elbow grease, you can easily end up with lots of plants, more plants than you even have time to plant. Other propagation methods, such as growing plants from cuttings and division, are also super economical. Just keep in mind that, whenever possible, growing plants from seed is the better choice to preserve genetic diversity. A common question is, are cultivars okay to use in a natural landscape? Although some cultivars have good features, such as Phlox paniculata, a selection from the wild that attracts more pollinators than the straight species. Most cultivars are propagated asexually, for example by cuttings or tissue culture. If you plant 15 asexually propagated plugs of a species, you get 15 genetically identical clones. If you plant 15 seeds of a species, assuming they all come up, you get 15 genetically unique plants. The lack of genetic diversity in a clonal population of plants fails to provide resilience. In contrast, the genetic diversity of straight species offers the possibility of genetic variations that might be better adapted to a changing environment, potentially ensuring a species' survival. Changes in flower anatomy in cultivars may make nectar and pollen inaccessible to insects, as is the case for these poofy-headed double cone flowers. Some flowers have ultraviolet nectar guides. We can't see them, but insects can. These patterns act like a map, guiding insects to the nectar and pollen. These maps may be scrambled or absent in cultivars. Another problem is that cultivars may cross-pollinate with wild populations of the straight species and contaminate the genetic pool of the wild population. This happens with rose mallow. The red foliage bred into cultivars is now showing up in rose mallow populations in the wild. Studies show that red foliage is significantly inferior as a caterpillar host plant. Sometimes such crossbreeding can even lead to the disappearance of the native species. In some cases, cultivars are your only choice. Some cultivars, such as those of the American chestnut, offer resistance to diseases that threaten straight species populations. And cultivars with their compact growth, for example, can play a role in building acceptance for a more natural look. It's just that when it comes to supporting genetic diversity for a resilient landscape filled with wildlife, it's best to stick with straight species grown from seed whenever possible. In the handout, I've included these 3 pages from Nature's Action Guide with tips for procuring plants on a tight budget to make it easier to plant generously. I've also included these 2 pages in the handout to show how to make these upcycled pots for growing plugs and long-lasting plant labels to help us move toward zero waste. I highly recommend this video, listed in the handout, to learn more about growing specific species of native plants of the Mid-Atlantic region from seed. With our landscape designed to please and our plants in place, all that's left now is to care for our property in a wildlife-friendly way that adds to its appeal. In addition to design, how we care for our landscape determines how people will respond to it. Cues to care, another concept introduced by Joan Nassauer, are visible actions that can help our landscapes gain acceptance wherever we live. A tidy mailbox area and a welcoming entrance help build acceptance, as does a clean and tidy exterior. Reducing lawn, if you have any lawn, is an important action to support biodiversity. But keeping a small patch of mowed lawn can signal to your neighbors that you're actively maintaining your landscape, allowing your surrounding landscape to be more natural. Along with the other cues to care, keeping sidewalks and pathways clear and staking floppy plants or planting them in the back of the bed go a long way toward making a natural landscape visually appealing and culturally acceptable. Believe it or not, there's supposed to be a pathway in the photo on the left. This is an extreme example of an unacceptable pathway to the front door. My front door. There was a yellow jacket nest right in the middle there, and having been stung twice, I avoided going anywhere near there all summer. With some thought toward design and regular upkeep, our own landscapes, filled with birds and butterflies, can inspire others to embrace a more natural look. But sometimes, even a slightly more natural approach can run against a restrictive HOA. If that's the case where you live, become informed. Get to know the exact HOA policies. Be intentional about your designs. Learn more about how to work with an HOA by visiting Homegrown National Park. They provide steps for proactively building positive relationships with HOAs. If you receive a citation, check out the detailed guidelines offered by Wild Ones. They host an informative video, What to Do When the Weed Police Knock on Your Door. Staying calm, persistent, and positive helps bring about an agreeable outcome. Sharing our wildlife habitat experiences and skills with others is one of the best ways to expand wildlife habitat. If you are fortunate to have the opportunity to share your wildlife habitat with children, giving children experiences with nature builds lasting connections, often leading to a lifetime of caring about the natural world. In the handout, I've listed these books that are filled with ideas for instilling a love of nature in children. In particular, Nature Play at Home is filled with ideas about designing outdoor spaces to engage children with nature. Finally, take the time to enjoy your wildlife landscape. Your presence in the garden is one of the best ways to encourage neighborhood acceptance, and your shadow is the best guarantee that your wildlife habitat will both thrive and be beautiful. All around us are the reminders of the effect our human activities have upon wildlife, giving us all the more reason to do whatever we can to support biodiversity and our local ecosystems. This chart in the handout sums up the steps for creating a biodiverse wildlife habitat and paints a picture of a landscape filled with life. In spaces large and small, your wildlife habitat will make a difference. Whether you're just starting out or leagues beyond, as we work together to create resilient wildlife habitats that help to address both biodiversity loss and climate warming, I'm so glad to be on this journey with you. Thank you for all you do. I'm happy to answer any questions. Here once again is the link for the handout. The Biota of North America program maps, known as the BONAP maps, are an incredibly useful resource for determining if a plant you've identified is a welcome native or, hopefully not, an invasive plant. Let's take a look at the BONAP maps for a couple of honeysuckles. Search online for BONAP County and the species you're wondering about. Here the lime green shows us that twinberry is native to many counties in the western U.S., but none at all in the east. Yellow indicates that a plant is native to this county, but rare. Here, aqua blue shows us that Japanese honeysuckle is introduced in these counties, and bright pink indicates that it's found in this county and it's on a state or county noxious list. This is the honeysuckle that many of us are familiar with, unfortunately for us. Teal green represents a plant that is inventive, meaning there are established populations, but the plant is not actually native to the region. Instead, it's native in a neighboring region. For example, although purple count... Okay, let's just stop.